I never thought a routine transfer could make my stomach turn. But here I was, boarding a military transport to a station so remote it didn't exist on most maps. My orders were brief, unsigned, and cryptic. Report immediately to the Deep Sea Division. I had spent years in Navy diving operations, handling salvage, recon, and occasional research support, but nothing like this. Nothing that came with secrecy levels high enough to make even the officers in charge avoid my questions. The flight itself felt surreal. I watched clouds shrink beneath me, trying to ignore the unease pressing against my ribs. There were no fellow passengers, just the hum of the engines and a single officer sitting across from me, silent, watching every move I made. He didn't speak, didn't even acknowledge my presence, but the weight of his stare made the air feel heavier. I caught myself imagining what it would be like if the plane just disappeared over the ocean, swallowed by the same abyss I was about to descend into. My stomach clenched. When we landed, the station was nothing like the bases I'd been to. Concrete buildings jutted from jagged cliffs, surrounded by storm-tossed seas. The wind sliced across my face as I stepped off the plane, and a cold mist rolled over the pier. Every detail, the sound of the waves, the smell of brine, even the patterns of ice forming on the handrails, seemed heightened. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like someone had left me alone in a place that belonged to something else. Inside, the station's corridors were narrow and sterile. White lights reflected off the metal walls. Personnel moved quickly, silently, never pausing long enough to look at me. I signed in at a station and handed over my credentials. A junior officer led me to a briefing room without explanation. As the door closed behind me, I noticed a strange set of symbols etched into the doorframe. They were subtle, almost imperceptible, but they made me feel uneasy. I frowned and shook my head. I was tired. I'd been trained to focus, but instinct screamed at me that I wasn't supposed to be here. The briefing itself was brief and strangely indirect. A senior officer, his uniform adorned with pins I didn't recognize, outlined the mission without detail. "We've detected structural anomalies near a trench," he said, gesturing to a map that was too dark to read clearly. "Depths exceed any previous operations. We need a full team on standby for assessment and recovery. Your orders are simple: follow protocol, maintain observation, and report anomalies." I asked questions. Which trench? What anomalies? The officer's gaze sharpened. He leaned back and allowed a faint sigh to escape. "Details will be provided in the field," he said. "For now, follow orders. Assume the structure is stable but not fully understood. Discretion is paramount. You are not authorized to discuss findings with anyone outside this team." That's when I noticed the other divers in the room. They were not casual faces from standard deep-sea assignments. They were silent, careful, every motion precise, as if every habit had been rehearsed 100 times. Two of them exchanged a glance when the trench was mentioned. Their eyes said something I couldn't place. I tried to read it: fear, respect, caution, but it was unreadable. They had been here before, or worse, they had seen what I was about to see. The equipment was laid out on a long table. Suits, reinforced for extreme depth. Helmets with sensors and symbols etched inside. I noticed them carefully. Nothing was explained. Every piece looked experimental, beyond the designs we normally trusted. The plating was thick, the insulation heavy, and the gloves seemed almost cumbersome. Every item radiated a sense of purpose. Every item screamed that we were entering territory no human had any business in. The officer gave one final instruction before dismissing us. "Remember your training, respect the protocol. Do not speculate, do not engage with unknown entities, and above all, never discuss what you encounter outside the station. If you do, the consequences are severe." He paused. His eyes scanned the room slowly, lingering on me longer than necessary. I felt my throat tighten. Then he nodded sharply and left. I stayed behind for a moment, staring at the gear. I could feel a pulse of unease growing in my chest, a subtle warning from instinct I had learned to respect. The ocean has rules. The Navy has rules, but whatever was waiting at that trench obeyed neither. Later in my bunk, I tried to sleep, but every sound, the hum of the station's engines, the distant slap of waves, felt magnified. Shadows in the corners of the room stretched unnaturally. Every instinct screamed that I was crossing into something forbidden. In the past, I had survived dives where equipment failed, where storms trapped us beneath ice, where currents threatened to crush a human body in seconds. Nothing prepared me for the unknown I was about to face. As night deepened, I heard a faint vibration through the floor. I tried to convince myself it was the machinery, the deep hum of the station settling, anything natural. But the vibration was rhythmic, subtle, deliberate. It felt alive. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, knowing that the real test was still hours away, that the trench was waiting. I thought of my years in the Navy, the routine dives, the predictable dangers. I thought of the faces of friends lost in the deep, and I realized with a cold certainty that nothing I had done before could prepare me for this mission. The trench was alive in some way, or something within it was alive, and it had been waiting for us. I closed my eyes, but I could still feel it. The station, the wind, the ocean itself seemed to vibrate in response to the deep. This assignment was no longer about protocol or recovery. It was about surviving the unknown. I clenched my fists, my mind racing, but I knew the rules. Follow orders, stay silent, and pray that nothing followed us beyond the surface. Morning would come, the flight to the trench would begin, and I would take my first steps into darkness deeper than I had ever known. I could not imagine what lay below, but I could feel it already, watching, waiting, aware of every movement we made. By the time the call came to assemble for deployment, I was ready, but not in the way I wanted. I was ready in the only way possible, cautious, alert, and aware that whatever waited at the bottom of that trench was not something I could fight with training or technology. It was something else entirely. And from the first moment I stepped into that station, I understood that the Navy had never intended for anyone to talk about it. The assignment had begun. We suited up in silence. The reinforced gear felt heavier than normal, the metal plating cold against my skin. Every movement reminded me that this wasn't just another dive. Helmets clicked into place, and I noticed the strange symbols etched inside, small carvings along the inner lining that didn't match any known Navy coding or procedural marking. I glanced at the others. Two veterans exchanged a brief, almost imperceptible nod when the trench was mentioned. Their eyes held that same unreadable warning. Whatever awaited us, it had been seen before. The carrier submersible was unlike anything I had piloted. The cabin was cramped, all walls lined with equipment I barely recognized. Pressure gauges and monitoring systems glowed faintly, displaying numbers that pushed past every depth I'd ever reached. The hum of the engines vibrated through the metal floor, but beneath it, there was a subtle, almost imperceptible resonance, like the sub itself was responding to the water outside. I pressed my palm to the console to steady myself, but the vibration seemed to continue through my bones. We began the descent slowly. The surface of the ocean disappeared in moments, replaced by a dark, churning abyss. Floodlights illuminated a narrow tunnel of water around us, but beyond the beams there was nothing. My eyes tried to adjust to the blackness, to find some sign of life or shape. I noticed a faint current against the sub, slight, almost playful, pushing and pulling as if the ocean had its own will. I mentioned it to Mason, but he waved it off, saying the water shifts unpredictably at this depth. I didn't believe him, not entirely. As we went deeper, the numbers on the depth meter climbed at a rate that made my chest tighten. 1,000 feet, 2,000, 3,000. The cabin pressure creaked and groaned. I focused on the instruments, checking every gauge, noting every fluctuation. It felt like the sub itself was breathing, the walls pulsating subtly under the immense weight of the water. I kept imagining a shadow moving just beyond the lights. Every time I looked, nothing was there, and yet I could feel the presence. Mason's hands were steady on the controls. He didn't speak much, only calling out readings when the computer flagged anomalies. I could tell he was uneasy, even if he hid it well. The veterans remained quiet, their eyes scanning every display and every corner of the cabin. I noticed their subtle shifts, how they adjusted their visors, tapped their gloves against sensors, always alert. They had been down here before. I could feel it in the way they moved, in the tension radiating off them. At nearly 4,000 feet, the water began to change. The darkness thickened, absorbing our lights as if the abyss itself was swallowing them. Visibility dropped to mere feet beyond the sub. Instruments started flickering. Depth gauges jerked inexplicably. Sonar picked up shapes that couldn't be identified, moving too smoothly to be marine life, too large to be debris. I tried to rationalize it. Currents, equipment interference, hallucinations from pressure. None of it fit. My heartbeat began to quicken. A low hum, faint but distinct, began to resonate through the hull. It was different from the sub's engines, deeper, almost like a heartbeat. I felt it through my chest. The others noticed it too. One diver whispered under his breath, "It's responding." No one challenged him, though the words made me shiver. The symbols inside our helmets suddenly felt significant, almost like they were warnings we hadn't understood. Every pulse seemed to sync with the hum, and I felt an unease unlike any I'd ever known in the water. We approached the coordinates for the trench. The walls of water stretched endlessly around us, smooth and featureless. Our instruments began to behave erratically. The magnetic readings spiked, then fell to zero. Lights flickered. The sub groaned. Mason muttered about instrument recalibration, but I couldn't ignore what I was feeling. There was intelligence down here, movement that was deliberate. I could feel it pressing against the hull, watching, calculating. Before reaching the trench, a sudden jolt rocked the sub. Alarms blared for a fraction of a second, then silence. The crew tensed. Mason adjusted ballast and thrusters, muttering under his breath. I scanned the floodlights and saw it, a ripple in the black water beyond the beams. It moved too smoothly to be a current, too controlled to be a creature. I leaned closer to the glass, but the darkness swallowed it before I could identify its shape. Everyone tried to maintain composure, but I could feel fear growing quietly in the corners of the cabin. Command instructions crackled over the intercom. Maintain course. Depth is within operational parameters. Report anomalies immediately. The calm tone contrasted sharply with the rising tension in the sub. I swallowed hard, wishing the reassurance could reach the pulse vibrating through the hull. The shadows outside seemed to shift, gliding along invisible paths. I felt my suit tighten around my chest, almost as if it was responding to the pressure and the unknown presence pressing in from all sides. The final 100 feet before the trench were the hardest. Instruments went haywire. Lights stuttered. Currents pushed us offline, then corrected as if guided. I gripped the armrest tightly, feeling every vibration through my fingers. Mason's voice remained steady, but I caught the tremor. The two veterans barely moved, their eyes locked on screens, visors reflecting the black beyond the cabin. I realized then that we were crossing into a domain that had rules none of us understood, and that whatever waited below had been expecting us. The trench appeared finally, darker than black, with walls that looked almost unreal. The sub's lights barely illuminated a narrow corridor into the void. Depth gauges registered numbers I wasn't supposed to see, beyond rated safe limits. And yet, command instructed us to descend further. Fear sank deep into my bones. I could feel the pulse of something alive resonating through the sub's hull. I knew, without a doubt, that whatever was down there had been waiting for explorers like us. Mason checked the final systems. Everyone ready? His question felt ritualistic. I nodded, trying to steady my breathing. The veterans adjusted their equipment silently, expressions unreadable. The descent protocol was more than just a procedure. It was a barrier against what we could not comprehend. I held onto my seat, feeling the sub start its final plunge toward the unknown. Every instinct screamed that we were crossing into something beyond human understanding. And in that moment, I realized the Navy hadn't sent us here to explore. They sent us to witness. The sub descended into the abyss, a small metal vessel surrounded by infinite black water. Every light we carried seemed feeble, barely cutting through the darkness. I gripped the console in front of me, feeling the vibration of the hull beneath my palms. It was constant, low, almost a hum, but beneath it ran something deeper, something alive. I had been in deep water before, but this was different. The pressure didn't just press on my body, it pressed on my mind. Navigation instruments flickered as we went deeper. Sonar returned strange echoes, shapes that moved smoothly without the chaotic patterns of normal marine life. Currents shifted unpredictably, pushing and pulling the sub. I checked the gauges over and over. Nothing should be able to survive this depth, and yet something was moving down there just beyond the lights. My heartbeat accelerated. I swallowed hard and adjusted my visor, trying to see past the darkness. Mason's hands were steady, but I could feel his tension radiating in the small cabin. He called out system checks every few minutes, voice calm but clipped. The veterans remained quiet, scanning screens, noting every anomaly without comment. I kept stealing glances at them. Their eyes reflected the depth in ways I didn't want to understand. They had been here before. They knew. I felt an instinctive dread, like someone was watching me through the water itself. At 2,000 feet, the first abnormal current hit. It pushed the sub sideways, then corrected with a precision that made my stomach drop. I glanced at Mason. "Currents irregular," I said, voice tight. He didn't respond, just adjusted thrusters. The sub groaned under pressure, but it wasn't the weight of water. It was something else, something moving outside, unseen but deliberate. I pressed my forehead against the glass. Darkness stretched for miles. There was nothing, and yet I felt the presence, patient, aware, calculating. The low hum started next. I felt it in my chest before I heard it. Mason noticed it too, but he didn't say anything. It wasn't a sound of the sub. It was something external, vibrating through the water, through metal, through bone. I traced it to no source. The pulse was rhythmic, deliberate. It made the hairs on my arms stand on end. One of the veterans leaned forward slightly, tapping his gloves on the console. I realized then that they recognized it. They had felt this hum before. Lights flickered and I caught movement at the periphery. A shape darted too quickly for a normal creature, then disappeared. The sonar chimed once with a blip that made my stomach knot. I leaned closer, trying to stabilize the feed, but every image seemed distorted, twisted by pressure or something else entirely. It wasn't just water out there. It was an environment alive with intelligence I could not define. The deeper we went, the more oppressive the darkness became. I could feel the sub being watched, every movement calculated, every response anticipated. The hull groaned under pressure, though the readings showed we were within safe limits. I knew that reading wasn't enough. Nothing about this descent felt normal. I kept thinking of the trench, the anomaly command had been so secretive about. Whatever waited there had been expecting us. A sudden vibration pulsed through the hull, stronger this time. It wasn't random. It came in intervals precise, almost like a heartbeat. I pressed my palms against the console, feeling the rhythm pass through me. The veterans shifted slightly, but they remained silent. Mason adjusted the sub again, murmuring technical notes I barely registered. I tried to keep my breathing steady. Every instinct screamed at me to stop, to retreat, but retreat wasn't an option. Not now. The water thickened around us. Floodlights illuminated nothing but particles drifting in the abyss. The sub-sensors returned readings that contradicted each other. Temperature spikes, depressions in pressure, currents that didn't obey natural physics. I leaned back and studied the displays. The anomaly wasn't just geological. It was something alive, and it was interacting with us, measuring us, testing us. My stomach churned. The thought came unbidden. We were intruding into territory that had never welcomed humans. Suddenly, a pressure wave hit. The sub lurched violently and alarms blared. I gripped the armrests as Mason stabilized the vehicle. The blast felt like it came from every direction at once. A shadow moved outside, larger than anything I had seen, gliding through the darkness without sound. I couldn't describe it. Its edges bent reality like water and light refracted in impossible ways. I swallowed, heart hammering, and tried to keep my voice calm. "We're still stable," I said. It sounded hollow even to me. The hum intensified, vibrating through the hull. I could feel it in my teeth, in my bones, in the back of my skull. It was deliberate, intelligent. The pulse matched some unspoken pattern in my mind, and I realized I was reacting instinctively to it. Something wanted us here, not to kill, not to attack, to observe, to witness. The thought made my skin crawl, but I could not deny the truth. We had crossed into the zone, the place where the trench waited, alive and aware, beyond our comprehension. Every instrument was reacting. Depth gauges spiked then dropped. Sonar blips appeared and vanished. Lights flickered, catching shapes that were not marine life. I kept expecting the sub to fail, but it held. Somehow, the hull resisted the abyss, yet I knew resistance meant nothing here. Out there, beyond the lights, something measured time differently. Its patience was infinite. Its presence was absolute. Mason finally spoke, calm but tight. "Prepare for trench entry. Final approach in 5." I nodded, gripping the console. The veterans adjusted equipment, their movements deliberate, practiced. I realized that we were not entering an unknown space. We were entering a waiting space prepared for us, designed with us in mind. The pulse throbbed through the sub, stronger now. My vision narrowed, my focus locking on the dark corridor ahead. And then I saw it, the first hint of the trench, a black void stretching impossibly deep. The sub's lights caught the edges, smooth and symmetrical, walls unlike anything natural. There was no texture, no sediment, no randomness, just perfect geometric void. I felt a chill. The water beyond seemed heavier, as if it were a solid waiting to be penetrated. My stomach sank. Command's voice cut over the intercom. Calm, clipped, detached. "Maintain course. Descend to trench floor. Observe, record, and do not engage." I swallowed hard. The words did little to reassure me. The pulse of the abyss thrummed through the hull. We were going in, and whatever waited below already knew we were coming. I gripped my console tighter, bracing for the unknown. The descent protocol had brought us here, to the edge of human understanding, to the threshold of something alive and patient. I realized with a sinking certainty that once we crossed the trench threshold, nothing would ever be the same. The abyss was waiting. The trench appeared like a gaping wound in the ocean floor. Its walls were impossibly smooth, unnaturally symmetrical, and they seemed to stretch farther than the sub's lights could illuminate. I leaned forward, pressing my visor against the glass. Every fiber of my being screamed that this wasn't just geology. This was architecture. Something built, not formed. My fingers traced the edge of the console, gripping it as if it could anchor me to reality. As we hovered at the trench's edge, instruments went haywire. Depth gauges fluctuated wildly, temperature sensors registered impossible warmth, and the magnetic readings swung like a pendulum. The hum we had felt during the descent grew louder, resonating through the sub in waves. It was no longer subtle. It felt deliberate, alive, responsive. I could feel it pressing into my chest, syncing with my heartbeat. Mason adjusted the thrusters carefully, but even his steady hands betrayed tension. "Final approach in 2 minutes," he said, voice tight. The veterans didn't speak. They simply monitored the instruments, their eyes reflecting the black void before us. I caught a glimpse of symbols etched inside my helmet and realized they were glowing faintly, reacting to the trench's presence. The realization hit me cold. This place knew we were here. A metallic sheen reflected off the trench walls, faint and shifting. It wasn't natural. It caught the light of our sub's exterior lamps and vanished before I could identify it. Every instinct I had screamed to retreat, but Command's orders over the intercom left no room for hesitation. "Maintain course. Descend and record. No contact unless authorized." We began the slow descent into the trench, the sub creaking and groaning under the strain of depth and pressure. Every meter closer made the walls seem more oppressive. The water around us thickened, absorbing the light like a living curtain. I glanced at Mason, then at the other divers. Their expressions were unreadable, but I could feel the tension in the cabin. Fear was present, unspoken, a silent companion in the pressurized metal cocoon. Then the first anomaly appeared. One section of the trench wall bulged outward, a smooth distortion that rippled slightly, almost like a living muscle beneath the stone. Instruments spiked as if reacting to it. The pulse we had been feeling intensified, vibrating through my suit, rattling my teeth and tightening my chest. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. Something was pressing against the wall, something massive and intelligent. One of the veterans leaned forward, eyes narrowed. A low mutter passed through his helmet comms. "It knows we're here." I didn't respond. My hands shook slightly on the console. Mason adjusted our position, but even his thrusters couldn't counter the subtle push of the current. It wasn't a current at all. It was intentional, directed. We were being guided or herded deeper into the trench. I noticed carvings along the trench walls, faint geometric patterns that pulsed with dim light. They were older than anything I could identify, etched with precision that defied logic at such depth. I reached out instinctively to touch the sub's external arm, trying to connect with the structure to understand it. A vibration pulsed through my gloves and the symbols inside my helmet flared in sync. I pulled back quickly, heart pounding. This wasn't just architecture. It was alive, or at least aware. Command's voice cut through my panic. Remain on course, no deviations. The calm detachment was unsettling. There was no hesitation, no acknowledgement of what we were experiencing. The Navy's orders made one thing clear: we were observers, not participants. Anything else was forbidden. As we descended further, the trench walls began to curve inward slightly, forming a corridor that felt almost claustrophobic. The sub's lights struggled to penetrate the darkness, illuminating only fragments of the smooth surfaces. Each reflection seemed unnatural, almost metallic. The pulse continued, stronger now, resonating through the hull. My breathing was shallow, my knuckles white against the console. I realized that whatever had shaped this trench had done so with intention. It was waiting for us. Suddenly, a flash of movement caught my eye. Something darted along the wall, too fast and too precise to be marine life. I followed it with the floodlights, but it vanished instantly, leaving nothing but smooth rock in its wake. The sub trembled slightly, and I felt the pulse thrum through me as if the trench itself were alive. The veterans exchanged glances but said nothing. Their silence was confirmation. This had been seen before. I tried to focus on the instruments, on the readings, on anything that would ground me. The depth gauge climbed into impossible numbers. Temperature and pressure remained stable only on display. Outside, the trench walls seemed to pulse, almost imperceptibly, like a slow heartbeat. I realized then that the trench wasn't just an environment. It was a sentinel. It reacted to our presence, measured us, and allowed us in only on its terms. Mason adjusted thrusters again, holding the sub steady in the corridor. The pulse intensified. The walls shimmered faintly. I could feel the vibration inside my chest, my jaw, my spine. It was like the trench was alive, breathing, aware. I swallowed hard. The voice in my head whispered a warning, primal and urgent, but there was no turning back. We were already inside. A metallic glint caught my eye, embedded along the far wall. It looked like part of a structure, but it reflected our lights like polished steel. I leaned closer, pressing my visor against the glass, but it vanished when I tried to focus. The pulse in my helmet grew louder, now almost painful. I realized the symbols etched in my helmet weren't random. They were resonating with the trench, reacting to our presence, preparing us for something we could not comprehend. The sub creaked under the strain of depth, but the reading still indicated all systems normal. I clenched my fists on the armrests, heart hammering. Outside, the darkness seemed to stretch infinitely, walls disappearing into blackness beyond the reach of our lights. I felt a tug in my stomach, a sensation that we were not just descending into a trench, but into something alive, aware, ancient. Command's voice came again. Prepare for exit. Observation protocols begin immediately. The order was calm, clinical. It belied the danger, the presence, the pulse that vibrated through my body. I realized that what awaited us in the trench would not be discovered, studied, or controlled. It would be experienced. We had crossed into a forbidden domain, and the trench was aware of our intrusion. I braced myself. The sub stabilized, lights fixed on the floor of the trench. Shadows shifted across the walls. The pulse throbbed in sync with my heartbeat. I felt it in every muscle, every nerve. I had no idea what awaited us, only that we were about to step into a place alive with a presence older than the Navy, older than humanity itself. The descent was over. We hovered at the threshold of the trench, ready to exit. I could feel the weight of observation pressing from the darkness, and I knew with certainty that once we stepped out of the sub, nothing would be the same. The trench had waited for us, and now we were here. The moment I stepped out of the submersible, the floor of the trench felt wrong. It was solid, yet somehow pliable under the boots of our suits, like walking on cold, dense rubber. Floodlights from our helmets cut through the oppressive darkness, revealing geometric patterns etched into the stone floor. They weren't random. Lines intersected at angles I had no frame of reference for, forming shapes that felt alien and intentional. The vibrations beneath my feet matched the pulse from the trench walls. Every step I took sent a shiver up my spine. I reached out to touch the nearest pattern, and the moment my gloved fingers made contact, a subtle vibration passed through my suit. It wasn't painful, but it resonated like the stone recognized me. Mason and the other divers followed, cautious, scanning every angle. One of them signaled ahead, pointing toward a small alcove partially hidden in the trench wall. I squinted, straining to see. Something moved inside. A flicker of shadow, precise and deliberate, darted behind the rock face. I tried to call it out over comms, but the words felt hollow. The structure around us seemed to respond. Faint electromagnetic pulses rippled along the walls, faint blue light racing through the etched grooves. I could feel the pulse in my spine, almost like a low hum syncing with my heartbeat. It was alive in some way, or at least it had mechanisms beyond anything we had ever encountered. I realized with a shiver that this place was older than any human structure, older than the Navy, older than anything I could comprehend. Mason adjusted our position, keeping us close together. He glanced at the alcove, then back at me. His eyes said what the others didn't: we weren't supposed to approach. Command orders were clear. Observation only, but instinct gnawed at me. There was intelligence here, aware of our presence, and it was watching. The subtle movement inside the alcove confirmed it. Something had noticed us. As we moved carefully along the trench floor, I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. Shadows stretched and bent unnaturally in our lights. The walls pulsed faintly, almost like they were breathing. I caught sight of something metallic embedded along the far wall, reflecting our helmet lights in sharp, quick flashes. It wasn't debris. It had structure, purpose. It moved slightly, just enough to make me step back instinctively. The deeper we went, the warmer it became. The water around us, though thousands of feet below the surface, felt slightly heated. My suit sensors confirmed it. No normal geothermal activity explained this. The structure itself radiated energy, subtle but undeniable. I reached out instinctively, letting my gloved hand hover over a patterned pillar. The vibration passed into my suit again, resonating in my chest, along my arms, threading through every nerve ending. A diver ahead pointed frantically toward another opening, smaller and recessed. Shadows shifted inside, shapes moving just beyond comprehension. I caught glimpses of long, spindly forms, limbs perhaps, moving with deliberate precision. My stomach tightened. There was no sound in the water, no bubbles, nothing that belonged to marine life. And yet I could feel them, the shapes, the intelligence, watching, calculating, studying us in return. Command's voice broke over the intercom, calm but insistent. Keep recording. Do not approach unknown objects or life forms. Maintain observation protocols. The words did little to comfort me. We were not observing. We were intruding, and the trench knew it. Every pulse, every subtle vibration confirmed it. The geometric carvings along the floor and walls seemed to shimmer faintly in response to our presence, like the entire structure was alive, reacting to us. I touched another portion of the stone floor where carvings intersected at sharp angles. A faint hum ran through my spine, matching the pulse of the structure. The sensation wasn't painful, but it was profoundly disorienting. I stumbled slightly, catching myself on the wall. I wasn't sure if it was the suit's weight, the pressure, or the trench's subtle influence. I felt a shiver race through me, a warning I couldn't ignore. The alcove ahead pulsed again. Shadows moved with precision, blurring in and out of focus. The divers exchanged glances. No one spoke, but the tension was palpable. It was as if the trench itself was holding its breath. I felt a strange warmth, almost comforting yet impossibly alien. I realized then that this place was designed to contain something, to preserve it, to observe. The awareness I felt wasn't just mechanical. It was intelligent, alive. I took a cautious step closer, heart hammering. Every instinct screamed that this was forbidden, that Command's orders were correct, and that touching anything could provoke a response. The shadows shifted slightly, and a brief reflection of light showed a smooth, curved surface embedded in the stone wall, metallic yet organic in appearance. My pulse accelerated. We were not alone. Not truly. Mason signaled for us to halt. We formed a tight circle, helmets illuminating the surroundings. Faint pulses traced along the carvings, like the structure was acknowledging us. I swallowed hard. The vibrations along the floor and through the hull were growing stronger. Whatever was in the alcove remained unseen but undeniably present. I realized then that we were in the presence of something far older than the Navy, far beyond human comprehension. It didn't feel hostile yet, only aware. We were intruders, observers in a place that had waited centuries, perhaps millennia, for our arrival. I could feel its pulse syncing with mine, threading through the water, into our suits, into our minds. The structure, the shadows, the energy, they were all connected. Command's calm voice overrode my racing thoughts. Extraction protocols on standby, complete observation, no interaction. I nodded mechanically, trying to maintain control. But the sense of being watched, of the trench itself acknowledging our intrusion, refused to let me focus. Every movement of the divers was mirrored by the subtle shift of shadows, the faint pulse that ran like a low hum through our suits. We recorded everything, every pulse, every shadow, every vibration. The trench responded in kind. Light rippled faintly through carvings along the walls. Shapes in the alcove moved with deliberate precision. And I realized something profoundly unsettling. We were not alone, not in any conventional sense. Something was here, waiting, observing, and in some unfathomable way, interacting with us. I touched the wall one last time, careful not to provoke it. The pulse ran stronger through my glove, then dissipated slowly. I stepped back, glancing at Mason and the veterans. Their eyes reflected the same recognition, the same unspoken understanding. Whatever lay within this trench, it had been waiting for centuries, and now it knew we had arrived. We hovered in silence, helmets illuminating the geometric carvings, the faint metallic sheen along the walls, the subtle pulses in the stone floor. Everything in the trench felt alive, aware, and deliberate. I understood finally that our mission was no longer recovery, reconnaissance, or research. It was observation, witnessing, and surviving. We had made first contact. We had been hovering over the trench floor for what felt like hours, every step deliberate, every flash of our lights met with subtle responses from the structure. That's when I noticed it, a bulge along one of the walls, subtle at first but unmistakably moving. The stone didn't just curve. It swelled outward as if something massive pressed from behind it. I froze, hand on my console, heart hammering. Mason adjusted the sub slightly, trying to keep our formation steady. The veterans didn't flinch, though I could see the tension in their posture. The pulsing vibrations from the trench intensified, sending waves through our suits. It wasn't just pressure from the water. It was deliberate, alive, and aware. My chest tightened, and I felt a strange resonance in my teeth and skull, like the wall itself was communicating in a frequency we were only beginning to perceive. The bulge shifted again. Carvings along the trench floor warped subtly, lines bending toward the protrusion as if drawn by some unseen force. I leaned closer, trying to make sense of it, but my vision blurred. Shadows moved across my visor in impossible shapes, elongated and distorted, twisting like limbs that had no clear beginning or end. I swallowed hard, trying to ground myself. The pulse in my chest felt like it had a mind of its own. One of the divers closer to the bulge froze. His hand went rigid against his console, eyes wide behind the visor. "It's moving," he whispered, barely audible over the hum of the trench. Another pulse rattled the hull, stronger this time, and a deep vibration ran up my spine. I realized we were no longer simply observing. The thing behind the wall knew we were here. Command's voice came over the intercom, calm and clipped. "Maintain position. Do not engage. Record all anomalies." It sounded absurd. How could we maintain position when the very wall beside us was alive, pressing, reacting? My hands shook as I adjusted our lights to illuminate the bulge. The shape shifted again, retracting slightly, then pushing outward more aggressively. The vibrations intensified, running through our suits in waves, almost like the trench itself was alive, breathing, aware of every motion we made. I glanced at Mason. His expression was tense but controlled. "We need to keep distance," he murmured. I nodded. The sub's thrusters hummed quietly, countering subtle currents that weren't natural. The vibrations continued, rhythmic, deliberate, pulsing through the floor, the walls, even through my own bones. I felt my stomach lurch as the shadow behind the wall seemed to stretch, elongate, forming shapes too large, too precise to be anything known. The carvings in the stone responded. Lines glowed faintly as if energized by the presence. I realized the symbols inside our helmets were flaring in sync with the pulses, subtle lights that traced patterns across the visors. The structure wasn't passive. It reacted to us. It had been waiting, anticipating. We were intruders in a domain that had existed far longer than humanity. Another diver collapsed. His suit had briefly failed, alarms blaring before stabilizing. We rushed to secure him, adjusting his life support and monitoring his vitals. The bulge shifted again, almost in response to our movement. It retracted slightly, leaving the stone surface smooth, unbroken, and silent. The pulse through the hull began to fade, then returned stronger, vibrating like a heartbeat. I pressed my hand to my chest instinctively, feeling it in every nerve, every bone. I wanted to speak, to ask Mason what he thought we were seeing, but words felt inadequate. My voice caught in my throat. The trench was alive, not in the way of sea creatures, but in a way that defied understanding. The bulge, the subtle light, the pools and carvings, they all communicated something beyond language: awareness, observation, presence. The sub creaked under the pressure, but instruments remained stable. Outside, the trench walls pulsed faintly like veins beneath stone. Shadows danced in impossible patterns, shapes bending and twisting against the water. I felt as if we had entered a living organism, an entity older than time itself, aware of every heartbeat, every movement, every breath. Mason adjusted the sub to retreat slightly, though not too far. Command's orders echoed in my mind: maintain position, observe, record. But it felt impossible. The trench did not merely exist. It responded. It was aware. It was deliberate. And the thing behind the wall was just the beginning. I realized then that we had no frame of reference. No training could prepare us for this. Every pulse, every vibration, every flicker of light reinforced the truth. We were intruding, and the trench knew. Whatever lived behind the wall was part of the structure, or the structure was part of it. They were inseparable. One movement, one misstep, and the delicate balance we maintained could collapse in an instant. The vibrations reached a crescendo. I felt my suit tighten as if responding to the pulse. Shadows outside twisted into shapes I could not name, appendages, limbs, forms beyond comprehension. I forced myself to breathe evenly, to focus on the instruments, to remember that we were trained for this. But training did not account for something that was not just alive, but aware, intelligent, and patient. Then, as suddenly as it began, the bulge retracted completely. The wall was smooth once more. The pulse faded into the subtle hum of the trench. I exhaled slowly, though my heart continued to race. The divers adjusted their positions, eyes wide behind their helmets. Mason kept his hand on the controls, knuckles white, steadying the sub. I realized that this was a warning. Observation only. Do not engage. The trench and the thing behind the wall were patient. They did not attack. Not yet. But their presence was absolute, omnipresent. We were trespassers in a domain older than our comprehension, and the lesson had been made clear. We hovered silently, recording every anomaly, every pulse, every shadow. The trench was alive, and it had allowed us to witness it. I could feel it in my bones, in the vibrations through the hull, in the subtle flickers of light across my visor. We were intruders, guests in a domain that had existed for eons. And I knew, with a cold certainty, that the thing behind the wall was just the beginning. The trench opened up into a chamber I hadn't anticipated. Its entrance was subtle, nearly hidden behind the geometric walls, only noticeable because of a faint glow emanating from within. We hovered for a moment, helmets cutting through the darkness, lights reflecting off the smooth surfaces. The sub's vibrations hummed in sync with the trench's pulse. I felt it deep in my chest, like the chamber itself was breathing. The interior was spherical, impossibly symmetrical, a perfect globe of stone, or something like stone. Carvings adorned the walls, spiraling upward in patterns that matched the symbols etched inside our helmets. My visor reflected them back at me, flashing faintly with every subtle movement. It felt familiar, like a memory I couldn't place. A hum pulsed through the chamber, stronger than anything outside, vibrating through my suit in waves that resonated with my spine. Mason guided the sub closer, careful to maintain stability. The veterans moved cautiously, scanning every surface, noting the subtle details. Metallic orbs drifted weightlessly in the water, moving toward us in slow, deliberate paths, then retreating into the shadows before we could touch them. They weren't alive in the traditional sense, but their motion was purposeful. Observation again. The chamber was aware of our intrusion, responding in subtle, intelligent ways. I reached out to one of the floating orbs, gloved fingers barely brushing its surface. A ripple passed through the water, through the suit, through me. The orb spun slightly, reflecting light across the carvings, then retreated. My chest tightened as the pulse increased in intensity. This chamber wasn't merely a room. It was a construct of purpose. Something ancient, something alive had built it. It wasn't designed for human use. It was a vessel, a recorder, a sentinel. As we drifted further into the sphere, I noticed the air. Sensors displayed normal readings, but the environment felt breathable, almost familiar. The water, though present, didn't resist movement as it had outside the chamber. Currents were calm, almost inviting, yet the pulse remained, a constant reminder of the chamber's sentience. The walls themselves seemed to hum with low, resonant vibrations that threaded through my suit and into my nerves. The veterans signaled for us to proceed carefully. One of them pointed toward a central platform, a raised section in the middle of the sphere. Geometric symbols converged there, pulsating faintly. The chamber seemed to react to our proximity. Metallic orbs drifted closer, then spread out again, maintaining a delicate balance between observation and retreat. I could feel the intelligence in the chamber, probing us, gauging our responses, measuring our presence. I placed a hand near the platform. The pulse intensified immediately. My visor flickered with a strange light, tracing the carvings along the floor and walls. The symbols inside my helmet flared in sync. The orbs responded, moving rhythmically as if choreographed by some unseen hand. I realized that this was not just an environment. It was alive, intelligent, and interacting with us. The veterans remained silent, monitoring the platform. Mason adjusted the sub slightly, keeping us stable in the center of the chamber. The air, or what felt like air, was still but charged with energy. The pulse traveled through every inch of the sphere, through the walls, the floor, the water, and into us. I shivered. This was beyond comprehension. Nothing in the Navy had prepared me for this. Nothing in human experience could explain it. I noticed faint movement in the shadows along the walls. Shapes indistinct, elongated, shifted in response to our presence. They were not aggressive, not yet, but awareness radiated from them. Observation, calculation, patience. I realized that the chamber, the orbs, the shadows, they were all part of a network, an ecosystem of consciousness far older and far more deliberate than any human mind. The pulse strengthened. Metallic orbs drifted closer to the platform, hovering over intricate carvings. I could feel the vibrations sync with my heartbeat. It wasn't just pressure or energy. It was communication, a resonance designed to interact with whoever entered. I felt it threading into my thoughts, subtle, unrelenting, impossible to ignore. Mason gestured toward the central platform. We approached cautiously, recording everything. The carvings converged there in a pattern that seemed to spiral upward, toward some unseen apex. The orbs swirled rhythmically around the platform like planets in orbit, their movement deliberate, precise. The pulse thrummed in my chest, in my head, vibrating through every nerve ending. I realized then that this chamber had a purpose beyond observation. It preserved memory, consciousness, something ancient beyond human understanding. I reached out, hovering my gloved hand above the platform. The pulse surged violently through the chamber. Light flared briefly from the carvings, reflecting off the orbs, bouncing across the sphere in a dazzling, disorienting display. My stomach lurched. My vision flickered. The veterans remained calm, almost eerily composed, monitoring instruments and movement. Mason adjusted the sub to stabilize us, but the chamber itself shifted subtly, as if acknowledging our presence, accommodating us, testing our reaction. I felt a low resonance threading through my spine, matching the hum of the chamber. It was not sound as we knew it. It was awareness, contact, a subtle form of interaction that bypassed ordinary perception. Metallic orbs drifted closer, then receded, responding to our presence with precise choreography. The energy in the chamber was almost tangible, heavy, deliberate, alive in ways I could not rationally describe. As we moved around the platform, the carvings on the walls and floor flared again, subtle pulses in sync with the symbols inside our helmets. I realized that this sphere was a repository, a recorder of memory, of consciousness, of events beyond human history. And we were part of it now, our presence recognized, cataloged, observed. I glanced at Mason and the veterans. Their expressions were controlled but reflective. We had crossed a threshold. This chamber, this unmarked sphere, was not merely a space within the trench. It was alive, aware, and interactive. Observation alone was not enough. The pulse, the orbs, the carvings, they all responded to us. We were no longer just visitors. We were participants, recorded in memory, acknowledged by an intelligence beyond comprehension. I took a cautious step back, letting the sub maintain a buffer between us and the platform. The pulse subsided slightly, flowing through the chamber in waves. Metallic orbs drifted lazily back into the shadows, only their faint glimmer marking their presence. I felt the resonance in my suit ebbing, though the awareness remained. We had touched the heart of the chamber. We had made contact. And I knew with chilling certainty that this was only the beginning. As we hovered near the central platform, the chamber reacted. I could feel it before I saw it, a subtle vibration that threaded through my suit, my bones, my mind. The metallic orbs drifted closer, circling the platform in perfect rhythm. The carvings on the walls glowed faintly, spiraling with a light that seemed to pulse in response to our presence. My helmet symbols flared in sync, bright enough to cast subtle reflections on my visor. Something was about to happen, something that had been waiting for us to touch the platform. I reached out cautiously, letting my gloved hand hover over the intricate carvings. The moment my fingers brushed the surface, a burst of light erupted from the platform. It wasn't just illumination, it was sensation, sound, pressure, and vibration all at once. The light was blinding yet filtered, moving through every sense I had. My heart pounded as images slammed into my mind, unbidden, inescapable. I could feel them as much as see them. Shapes swam through black water, colossal monolithic forms rising from abyssal plains, strange geometries unlike anything found in human architecture. Shadows moved beyond comprehension, colossal silhouettes drifting in ways that defied physics. I realized I wasn't merely observing these visions. They were memories, recorded events, impressions, experiences. The chamber was showing us its history, its memory, as if it needed witnesses. A diver next to me began trembling, hands clenching on his helmet. His visor reflected shapes moving too quickly, too alien to focus on. I reached out instinctively, but he flinched away, eyes wide behind the glass. His breathing became rapid, shallow, and I could see panic rising. The chamber responded to him too, pulsing faintly, its hum threading through the air like a low-frequency song. I felt the visions pressing against my mind, layering over each other. The trench, the structure, the abyssal plains, they were all part of an ecosystem, a consciousness, a memory repository. I couldn't distinguish past from present. The experiences weren't mine, yet I felt them as though they were. Waves of pressure rolled over me, the water thickening around the sub in response to the pulse. I wanted to look away, to close my eyes, to escape, but I couldn't. The memory of a diver long gone appeared. His movements mirrored those we had just made. His final moments were recorded in the pulse. Something had followed him back into memory, something that had observed, judged, and perhaps taken note of his presence. I felt an icy chill, realizing the chamber preserved not just the structure and the abyss, but life, consciousness, events, and perhaps judgment. Mason's voice was clipped but calm. Maintain position. Record. No contact beyond observation. He tried to ground himself, and I followed, gripping my console. But the memory assault continued, images flashing across my visor, pressure waves distorting the water. The pulse threaded through our suits, synchronizing with our heartbeat, embedding impressions we could never fully articulate. The orbs drifted closer, moving in concentric patterns around the central platform. They reacted to our movements, slowing or accelerating as we shifted. I could feel them observing me directly, probing my responses, integrating me into their rhythm. It was unnerving, overwhelming, yet strangely intimate. This place, this chamber, was alive in a way I could never quantify. One diver began sobbing uncontrollably. His visor reflected shapes moving with increasing speed, tentacle-like shadows, elongated forms, movements impossible in the density of water. I realized with horror that the memory echo had followed him out of the vision, manifesting in his perception. The chamber wasn't just showing history. It was merging memory, observation, and presence into a single, incomprehensible experience. I gripped my console, struggling to maintain focus. The pulse grew in intensity, resonating through the sub and the surrounding water. I felt every vibration as a connection to something greater, a consciousness spanning the trench, the sphere, the abyss. It was older than anything human, aware of us as much as we were aware of it. The visions blurred the line between reality and memory. I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. The light from the platform pulsed in perfect rhythm with the vibrations, reflecting off the orbs and illuminating the carvings. Shapes moved across the walls, responding to our presence, tracing our paths in faint pulses of energy. I realized we weren't just observers. We were participants, integrated into the memory, recorded by the chamber itself. Every action, every glance, every breath was being cataloged. Mason's voice cut through the chaos again, calm but strained. Prepare for extraction, observation complete. But it wasn't over. The chamber pulsed stronger, resisting the idea of our departure. Currents swirled, thickening the water, making movement difficult. The orb spun faster, retreating only slightly when we attempted to pull back. The memory echo clung to us, threading its resonance through the sub and into our suits. I could feel it in my spine, a low hum threading through nerves and muscle, embedding itself in memory. Images continued to flash, divers long gone, structures rising and collapsing, colossal forms drifting beyond comprehension. The chamber wasn't finished with us. It wouldn't be. The resonance of the memory echo wasn't passive. It was alive, sentient, and deeply aware of our presence. Finally, after what felt like eternity, the light dimmed and the pulse receded slightly. One diver remained shaken, tears streaming inside his helmet as he whispered incomprehensible words over comms. Another simply stared, eyes wide as if seeing beyond the trench, beyond memory, beyond human comprehension. I struggled to steady myself, breath shallow, heart racing, mind reeling. We had witnessed more than human perception was meant to endure. The chamber had integrated us, allowed us to glimpse its memory, its consciousness, its ancient awareness. And when the light faded, when the pulse softened, one truth remained. The trench did not forget. It remembered. It observed. It judged. And we were now part of that memory, catalogued alongside countless others who had come before. Command's orders echoed in my mind as I exhaled slowly, trying to ground myself. Extraction only. Do not engage. But the chamber had already engaged with us. The memory echo had followed. We were altered, integrated, and there was no turning back. I realized then that we could leave physically, but part of us would remain in the chamber forever. The pulse, the visions, the resonance, they had touched something in us. And whatever awaited beyond this point, beyond the memory echo, would not be bound by human comprehension. Something had followed him back into memory, something that had observed, judged, and recorded every action, every thought, every heartbeat. The realization struck me like icy water. We were no longer merely witnesses. The trench, the chamber, the pulse, they had already incorporated us into their history. Every movement we made, every glance, every hesitation was being catalogued. A sudden stillness fell over the sub. The hum faded, the orbs froze mid-motion, and the carvings dimmed. It was as if the chamber itself were exhaling, and in that silence I understood the truth. This place did not forget. It did not forgive. It did not need us to survive. It only needed us to see. Mason's voice broke the silence, tight and low. It knows we're aware now. I nodded, unable to speak. The pulse returned, slower this time, deliberate, almost ceremonial. Shadows along the walls shifted, coalescing briefly into forms that hinted at intelligence far older than humanity. The diver next to me trembled, and I realized I felt it too. An ancient, indifferent gaze pressing against my mind, measuring not our strength but our very presence. Then the chamber began to retreat, subtly at first, the walls pulling back, the orbs drifting into the shadows, the carvings dimming like stars fading at dawn. The trench itself seemed to exhale, releasing us from its immediate awareness, but not entirely. A promise lingered in that pulse, a knowledge that we had been seen, catalogued, and marked. I pressed my palms to the console, feeling the last vibrations echo through my bones. Somewhere deep in the trench, something ancient waited, patient, aware, and eternal. As the sub began its ascent, leaving the chamber behind, I realized with cold certainty that nothing would ever be the same. The Navy had sent us to witness, yes, but the trench had sent us back changed. And in the deepest part of the abyss, I knew, we would always be part of it now. The assignment was over, the observation complete, but the witness would never end. The sub rose slowly, but the water outside seemed different now, thicker, heavier, almost alive. Light from the sub's exterior lamps warped unnaturally, bending as if refracted by something unseen, something vast. The instruments flickered sporadically, depth readings were inconsistent. Mason glanced at me, his face pale in the dim cabin glow. "Did you see that?" he whispered, voice trembling. I didn't answer. I couldn't. There had been something in the shadows of the trench, and it hadn't fully let us go. Then came the sound, a low, resonant hum that wasn't mechanical. It vibrated through the hull, in tune with the pulse we had witnessed in the chamber. The sub shivered as if it were a living thing, reacting to a presence that we could neither see nor name. Lee pressed her hand against the glass viewport. Her eyes widened in silent terror. "It's following," she said. The word barely left her lips before the lights flickered out completely, leaving only the faint, phosphorescent glow of the abyss outside. And then, in that suffocating darkness, I felt it, not watching from a distance, but inside our minds. Not a threat exactly, but an awareness, patient, intelligent, and indifferent to our panic. The sub continued upward, but the abyss felt endless. Every meter gained seemed to return us only to another depth, another shadowed corridor of water where the pulse still throbbed faintly, echoing in our skulls. I realized something terrifying. Leaving the trench physically didn't guarantee leaving it mentally. It had imprinted on us. We were no longer merely witnesses. We were part of its memory now. And somewhere below, something waited patient, waiting for us to forget, waiting for us to make a mistake. Because it knew we would never truly escape. The sub's lights flickered back on, weak and unreliable, casting pale, trembling beams across the cramped interior. Every shadow now felt deliberate, as if moving independently, stretching and curling where nothing should exist. Mason's hands shook as he tried to steady the controls. Lee's eyes were fixed on the viewport, but she wasn't looking at anything outside. "I can hear it," she whispered, her voice tight, trembling. "Not out there in my head." I pressed my palms against my ears, but the hum persisted, a low, omnipresent resonance, harmonizing with the thrum of my own heartbeat. It wasn't just sound. It was memory suggestion, like the abyss itself was replaying something ancient and personal, tailored to each of us. The comms crackled and a distorted voice came through. Not a human voice, something else, layered, synthetic, yet disturbingly familiar. "Return," it said. "Return or remain." The words weren't threatening, they were inevitable, certain. Panic clawed at Mason, and he lunged for the emergency ascent button, but I caught his arm. "Stop! We can't risk." The sub jolted violently, as if the water outside had grabbed hold. Instruments spun wildly. Depth gauges went haywire. Something immense brushed against the hull, leaving a ripple that propagated through the cabin like a shockwave. The lights dimmed again, plunging us back into oppressive darkness. Lee's voice cut through the panic. "It's learning us, watching how we react. Every fear, every doubt, it's cataloging it." I realized then, with cold clarity, that the trench didn't just exist in the ocean. It existed in our minds now. Every attempt to leave would carry its shadow with us, and every memory, every thought could be used against us. And somewhere in the abyss the pulse waited, patient, immortal, knowing we could never be the same again. The sub's hull groaned under pressure that should have shattered it long ago. Outside, the abyss stretched endlessly, a black void that seemed to bend light and sound, swallowing the world whole. It wasn't just deep water anymore. It was alive, a sentient force pressing against us from every angle. The instruments were useless. Sonar showed nothing but static, like the trench itself was erasing existence from technology. Mason was muttering incoherently, rubbing his temples as if trying to scrape away some invisible weight. I see things, shapes, faces crawling on the walls," he said, his voice cracking. "No, they're inside me, inside my head." Lee turned toward me, her face pale under the flickering lights. "It's not just him, it's all of us. It feeds on fear, but it doesn't stop there. It learns, it adapts. Every thought we have, every memory we cling to, it twists into something monstrous." I tried to speak, but my own voice sounded foreign. My memories felt layered, like someone else had rewritten the key moments of my life. My father's face, my first dive, the fear I'd buried, everything was crawling up the walls of my mind, distorted, impossible, and yet intimately familiar. I could hear the trench laughing, not audibly, but as a vibration inside my skull, resonating with my heartbeat, pulsing in time with every panicked thought. Then the viewport shivered, not from water pressure, but from something outside, pressing against the glass like a hand of shadows. Shapes moved just beyond the beam of the sub's weak lights, impossible geometries, elongated limbs, eyes that glimmered without reflecting light. I realized it wasn't creatures as we knew them. It was a reflection of our collective dread, made manifest in the darkness outside. Mason screamed and lunged for the hatch release. "We have to get out, now." Lee grabbed him, her fingers digging into his arm with a ferocity that betrayed her own terror. "There is no out, not here, not ever. The trench doesn't just take bodies, it takes minds. If we leave, we're already part of it. Don't you feel it?" The sub lurched violently again, throwing us against the walls. The hum of the abyss surged, louder, vibrating through steel, bone, and thought. Then, in that crushing silence that followed, I realized it was waiting, not attacking, not defending, just observing, learning, and deciding who among us would remain and who would be forgotten. In the corner of the cabin, a faint outline of something pressed against the wall, a dark smear that wasn't there before. I blinked, and it was closer, reshaping itself with our fears, reflecting every guilt, every doubt, every suppressed memory. I wanted to look away, but my eyes were drawn, compelled, as if the abyss itself had fingers gripping my soul. Lee whispered almost reverently, "This isn't survival, it's submission. It doesn't want us alive, it wants us changed." And in that moment, I knew we weren't just diving into the trench. The trench had already dived into us. Time began to lose meaning. The sub's lights flickered sporadically, throwing the cabin into intermittent shadows that seemed alive. Every second stretched like a scream. Mason's mutterings grew erratic, each word a fragment of some private terror. He clawed at his helmet, panting as if the pressure outside was inside his skull now. Shapes danced on the walls, sometimes fleeting, sometimes grotesquely detailed. One moment it was my own reflection staring back at me, eyes hollow and black, a grin splitting the face I knew so well. The next, it was the crew, Lee and Mason, morphing into grotesque parodies of themselves, limbs bending in impossible angles, mouths opening to produce no sound, only the sensation of being devoured from within. The instruments were dead. Depth gauges, sonar, communications, nothing worked. The metal of the sub seemed almost alive, vibrating in response to our panic, flexing like a living organism. Every bump or groan echoed not as sound but as a memory of fear, replaying over and over, as if the trench was drilling into our very consciousness. I tried to speak to Lee. "We have to focus, keep talking, keep your minds." But her eyes weren't her eyes anymore. They shimmered with a dark luminescence, reflecting visions I couldn't comprehend. Endless corridors, skeletal figures suspended in water, eyes pressed against every surface, watching us. She whispered, voice not hers but a chorus of whispers. "It knows everything, everything you've buried. Every choice, every lie, every regret. It's rewriting us, erasing us, and we can't fight it." Mason screamed suddenly, yanking open the storage hatch. From the darkness spilled a writhing black substance that seemed alive, reaching for him. His screams echoed in the sub like a chorus of thousands, and when he collapsed, the substance receded, leaving only a smear that glimmered wetly in the dim lights. I realized the trench didn't just manipulate the mind, it fed on certainty. Every memory I clung to, every belief I held was slowly being rewritten. My father's face became someone else's. My own reflection became monstrous. My identity, my sense of me, was eroding under the pressure of something that wasn't water, wasn't shadow, but something far older, far more patient, and far more intelligent. Then the viewport cracked, not a line but a ripple like liquid glass, and through it I saw the impossible. A vast figure, a silhouette of unimaginable scale, hovering silently just outside. Its eyes, or maybe the absence of them, pierced through me, unraveling thought by thought. I realized that if it reached us, it wouldn't kill. It would dissolve us, folding us into the abyss so completely that nothing would remain but our fears, replaying for eternity in the trench's consciousness. I felt my sanity unraveling, and yet, even as the darkness threatened to consume us, a faint glimmer of rational thought fought through. I knew we couldn't escape in the traditional sense. This was no mere wreck, no monster hunt. Survival meant understanding the trench on its own terms, but the question that clawed at me was horrifying. Could we understand it before it understood us completely? The sub groaned one final time, lights flickering out as the pressure of the abyss pressed closer than ever. I realized we had already crossed a point of no return. And in the blackness, I whispered to no one, "We aren't diving into the trench has already dived into us." The sub lurched violently, throwing me against the bulkhead. Mason was silent, curled into himself, muttering fragments of words that didn't form sentences. Lee's face, if it was still her face, was pressed against the viewport, wide-eyed, staring at something I could not see. I realized then that we weren't just under the sea. We were inside the trench's mind. Every sound became a memory, every vibration a hallucination. I heard my own voice whispering secrets I didn't remember telling anyone. Names, faces, regrets, sins, all cataloged and amplified. The trench didn't just see, it knew, and it was testing us. It wanted our thoughts, our fears, our identities. Mason screamed suddenly, pounding on the control panel, as if breaking the sub could sever the trench's hold on him. But each strike warped the metal and distorted the air around him. His voice multiplied, echoing endlessly, each scream slightly different, each one layering onto the next until it became unbearable. Lee tried to calm him, but her words became gibberish, twisted by the trench into mocking chants that echoed off every wall. Then the sub's lights died completely. Absolute darkness. In that silence, I felt the trench brush against me, not with tentacles or claws, but with thoughts, memories, visions I couldn't control. I saw the lives we had lived outside this nightmare, our families, our hopes, our lies, and realized the trench had a way of twisting reality into the ultimate horror, showing you not what is, but what you fear to remember. A shadow passed over the viewport, a massive form moving with impossible speed. I glimpsed patterns in the darkness, geometric shapes that shouldn't exist underwater, folding and unfolding as though reality itself had been ripped. Lee screamed again, this time in unison with Mason, their voices melding into something other, a sound I couldn't bear to identify as human. Panic overtook reason. I had to act. I fumbled for the emergency ballast release, knowing it might crush us or it might be our only chance. As the sub began to rise, the trench reacted, sending a pressure wave that buckled the hull. Every bone in my body felt like it was compressing and stretching at once. My mind teetered on the edge of breaking. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the world snapped back, or so it seemed. The lights flickered on, the instruments sputtered, and the monstrous presence outside the viewport was gone. Mason lay unconscious. Lee was slumped against the wall, eyes blank, murmuring numbers that made no sense. The sub was intact, but we were different. I realized something horrifying. We hadn't escaped the trench. It had let us survive, but only to ensure we carried its influence back to the surface. The abyss wasn't just a place. It was a predator, a teacher, a corruptor, and it had chosen us as its next vessels. I pressed my hand against the cold metal of the sub and whispered to myself, barely daring to breathe, "We're not returning to the world above. The world above is already inside us." If you want, the next part can be the surface confrontation, the moment they finally reach the surface. But the trench's influence begins manifesting in subtle, horrifying ways in the outside world, showing that the nightmare has followed them home. The sub breached the ocean's surface with a muted cough of hydraulics and rising bubbles. The sky was gray, heavy with storm clouds, as if the world itself had been waiting for our return. We emerged not into relief, but into a world subtly off, colors muted, sounds warped, a quiet that felt wrong. Mason stirred first, his eyes empty, unseeing. Lee blinked, but her pupils were unnaturally large, blackened, reflecting nothing but lightless voids. I wanted to call for help, to radio the naval station, but the radio crackled only static, punctuated by whispers, my own voice, laughing back at me with perfect mimicry. We climbed out onto the deck, the wind biting, the rain beginning to fall. At first glance, nothing seemed different. But then a seagull fell from the sky, hitting the deck like a stone, its eyes pure black, unblinking. Waves moved with an impossible rhythm, slapping the hull in patterns that almost spelled words. The trench was here, not physically but mentally, everywhere. Lee muttered names we had never spoken aloud, things only the trench could know. Mason began carving shapes into the deck with a knife, geometric patterns identical to what I had seen in the abyss, his hands moving as if guided by an external intelligence. I realized the trench had infected us. An infection meant it didn't need water anymore. It could reach the land, the sky, the mind. Every surface reflected subtle distortions. The horizon bent at impossible angles. Shadows moved against the wind. Even my own reflection in the wet metal seemed slightly delayed, a version of me that lingered just a second too long, grinning where I did not. Panic surged, but my body acted on instinct. I grabbed Mason, pulling him into the sub, forcing him to stay. Lee's whispers escalated into a chant, and I felt the world press in, trying to rewrite itself through her voice. The storm broke suddenly, rain slamming into the deck like fists. In that moment, I realized something vital. The trench hadn't let us escape. It had let us leave as carriers to spread its influence into everything above water. Any contact, any thought, any person we encountered could be tainted, warped, turned. I clenched my fists, feeling a cold dread wrap around my chest. Survival was meaningless if the world we returned to was already infected by the abyss. And then I knew what had to be done. We couldn't warn anyone. If we did, the trench would follow, its shadows crawling over everything like ink in water. The sub bobbed in the churning waves, a fragile capsule carrying 3 minds half-owned by the abyss. Above us, the clouds twisted into impossible shapes, and I understood. The trench had begun its campaign on land. Its influence would spread faster than any storm, invisible, unrelenting. I whispered to Mason and Lee, though I wasn't sure if they could hear me or if their own minds were already distant. We survive alone. The rest, they can't know. And as the storm howled, I realized the most terrifying truth. The abyss had no need to follow. It had already come. We made it to shore at dawn, though shore was deceptive. The coastline was littered with wreckage, debris half swallowed by sand, as if the ocean itself had been coughing up its victims. The air was thick, salty, and heavy with an unnatural scent, metallic and rotten all at once. Every step we took left footprints, but the sand seemed to shift beneath them, almost trying to erase our passage. Mason moved silently, his eyes glazed, tracing patterns in the sand that mirrored the trench symbols. Lee followed him without speaking, whispering in the guttural tones I had never heard before, words that resonated in my chest like an echo of the abyss. I tried to speak, to rally some plan, but my own voice sounded alien in my ears, brittle and thin. We found an abandoned shack, half collapsed, and decided to hide. Inside, shadows pooled unnaturally in the corners. Light bent around them, defying the angles of windows and door frames. Even our flashlights seemed hesitant, flickering not because of malfunction, but because something invisible was testing their reach. I realized then, the trench's influence didn't stop at water's edge. It followed us, subtle at first, shapes just beyond the corner of vision, sounds that should not exist, a pressure in the chest that tightened when we thought of leaving. Objects moved slightly when we weren't looking. A cup slid an inch, a chair tilted, all small signs of control. Mason began sleepwalking at night, drawing symbols in the sand outside, whispering to invisible presences. Lee's chants grew louder, more rhythmic, sometimes in a language I could almost understand, a mixture of mathematics, water sounds, and warning. Every night the world outside the shack grew stranger. Trees bent toward us, waves crashed in impossible rhythms on the distant rocks, and the wind carried voices that mimicked friends and strangers alike, laughing or screaming in alternation. I started to see it even in reflections. The water in the small puddles inside the shack wasn't simply reflecting. It watched. It pulsed. It showed things, visions of deep, cavernous trenches beneath our feet, filled with creatures that shouldn't exist, eyes everywhere watching us, judging us. I tried to fight it with logic, with reason. I mapped the shoreline, I collected supplies, I planned escape routes. But every time I left the shack, the world rearranged itself subtly. Paths curved impossibly, objects appeared where I hadn't placed them, and the same whispers followed me wherever I went. Then I realized, we weren't just infected. We were conduits. Whatever we had survived in the trench now moved through us like electricity, bending the world in tiny increments, spreading shadows over land as effortlessly as it had through water. We were the first on shore, the first carriers. And as night fell again, bringing cold winds and black, heavy clouds, I understood something worse than death. The trench did not need to return for destruction. It was already here. By the third night, our sense of time had begun to warp. The sun rose and fell in odd angles, sometimes lingering at the horizon for hours, sometimes vanishing behind clouds in a blink. The air itself seemed thick, making each breath feel like I was inhaling water. That night, while Mason continued his trance-like carvings in the sand, I ventured farther along the coast, trying to find any signs of life or escape. The shoreline was littered with strange debris, fragments of ships, twisted metal, even personal belongings that seemed impossibly recent. Shoes, letters, a child's toy, all worn with seawater but unmistakably human. And every time I bent down to inspect one, the whispering began. It wasn't just the wind or echoes from the surf. It was voices pleading, taunting, crying. They called names, names of people I didn't know and sometimes mine. I froze, listening, heart pounding. The sounds came from the water itself, but the waves didn't crash. They slithered along the sand, carrying the voices like they were alive. Lee appeared beside me without warning, her eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight. She whispered, "They've been waiting for us. They see through the veil." Before I could respond, she raised her arms and the waves reacted. Water lifted unnaturally, forming shapes like arms, reaching toward the shore, grasping for us without fully breaking into form. I stumbled back, but the tide didn't recede. It hovered, pulsating, hungry. Mason joined us moments later, chanting softly, carving another symbol in the sand. The moment his hands touched the wet ground, the shapes in the water writhed violently, retreating for a heartbeat, then returning with more force, more intent. I realized then, Mason and Lee weren't just conduits. They were summoning something or appeasing something, and I was caught in the middle. Suddenly, a shadow detached itself from the shoreline. Not human, not fish, not entirely water. It moved with a fluid grace, its shape constantly shifting, limbs appearing and vanishing in the moonlight. Its voice, if it could be called that, resonated directly in my skull, a mixture of anger, curiosity, and hunger. It spoke in fragments, syllables that sounded like the ocean breaking over stone: leave or join, sink or serve. I ran back to the shack, but the ground seemed to pulse beneath my feet. The trees bent toward me, the sand shifted like a living floor, and the air vibrated with low, mocking laughter. Behind me, Mason and Lee followed, seemingly unaffected, murmuring and whispering words I could not understand, but I knew instinctively they were either praying or commanding forces I could not see. When we reached the shack, I tried to barricade the door, but the shadow seeped through anyway, distorting the air, chilling the room with wet, heavy darkness. And then I understood something horrifying. Whatever had emerged from the trench, whatever had been following us, it didn't care about walls, about distance, about physics. It existed outside all rules. And it wanted us, not just to survive, but to serve. I realized that night that the shore wasn't a place of escape. It was a hunting ground, a test, and we were already part of its game. By the fourth night, the air inside the shack had turned thick and almost viscous. Every breath I took felt like it carried water, and every sound, the groaning of the floorboards, the rattling of the windows, was amplified into a chorus of torment. Mason and Lee moved as if in a trance, their eyes vacant but alert, their whispers merging with the low hum that now filled every corner of the room. I couldn't tell where their voices ended and the shadow's influence began. The shadow didn't remain outside. It seeped into everything. The walls pulsed as if breathing, the floor undulated under our feet, and the corners of the shack bent and twisted impossibly. I caught glimpses of faces, hundreds of faces embedded in the darkness, screaming silently, pleading or leering. Each time I blinked, one would vanish, replaced by another. The air smelled of salt and decay, the stench of drowned forests and sunken ships. I tried to talk to Mason, but his words made no sense. He was drawing sigils on the walls with a black, wet substance that smelled faintly of iron. Lee approached me, smiling in a way that was both familiar and horrifying, her eyes reflecting the shadow's impossible depth. "They told us you resist," she whispered. "But it's easier if you see, truly see." And then the hallucinations began. My hands appeared twisted, with too many fingers or sometimes missing entirely. The shack stretched and contracted, walls bending inward and outward, creating impossible hallways. I saw the ocean inside the room, waves slamming into invisible cliffs, and I felt cold water pull at my legs as if I were drowning while standing still. The shadow manifested in fragments now, arms, faces, and long, fluid shapes that slithered across the floor. They whispered my deepest fears, my secrets, even moments I had long buried. I realized it wasn't just trying to scare me. It was learning me, understanding my weaknesses, shaping reality to make me surrender. And then Mason and Lee stopped their chanting. The shack went silent except for the low pulsing of the shadow. They turned toward me, almost in unison, and their voices merged with the entity. You belong to the deep now. There is no shore, no escape, no light. Only service, only hunger, only the trench. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the air as if it never existed. The shadow wrapped around me, cold, wet, and sentient, its weight pressing into my chest, whispering that the shore, the shack, even the stars above, everything was its domain. By the time dawn approached, if it could even be called that, I realized I was no longer alone in my own body. Something inside me had changed, an awareness that wasn't mine, a hunger that wasn't mine, and a voice that was definitely not mine. The shack wasn't a shelter. It was a crucible, and I was its new vessel. By the time the sun rose, if it even truly rose in that cursed place, my sense of self felt like it was slipping through cracks in my own skull. The shadow didn't attack me anymore. It didn't need to. It had planted itself inside my thoughts like a parasite with roots spreading deeper every hour. Every time I blinked, I saw water, rushing water, black water. The sound of waves echoed inside my head even when I pressed my palms over my ears until they bled. The air tasted of salt, metallic and ancient, as if I were breathing from the lungs of something colossal and forgotten. Mason was the first to break. He stood in the center of the shack, arms limp at his sides, eyes fixed on something none of us could see. His lips trembled, mumbling a chant that sounded like a drowning man speaking from underwater. His voice gargled, bubbled, then steadied into a low, guttural tone that didn't belong to him. Lee watched him with a look of devotion, like she was witnessing a holy transformation. She kept repeating, "He's hearing it clearly now, it's teaching him." Teaching him what? I didn't want to know, but I could feel fragments of it scraping against my mind too, like barnacles attaching themselves, forming patterns, symbols, memories that weren't mine. Suddenly Mason gasped, as if surfacing from a deep depth. But his eyes weren't his anymore. They were completely black, not just the pupils, but the entire sclera swallowed by darkness so thick it absorbed the light around him. He smiled. It was the most horrifying expression I had ever seen. "Tides change," he whispered, "and the drowned come home." The planks beneath us swelled like soaked wood, wet, soft, breathing. I felt something push up from below, not physically but mentally, a presence, a summoning. My vision blurred. The shack dissolved into a flickering nightmare, walls melting into ocean cliffs, floorboards turning to sand, ceiling collapsing into open sky as storm clouds churned above me. But I hadn't moved. My body was still standing in the same place. It was the world that shifted around me, the shadow bending reality like wet paper. Lee walked toward me. Her feet didn't touch the ground. She drifted, her form shimmering, splitting into three, then back into one. Her voice layered with dozens of others, from children to deep, ancient tones. "You're almost ready," she said, touching my cheek with fingers that felt like cold seawater. "It's only painful until you stop fighting." My breath hitched. For a moment, and God help me, it felt soothing. Like the pull of the tide, the promise of sinking, of silence, of letting go of the constant fear. But something inside me resisted, some primal instinct clawing at the remnants of my sanity. I stepped back. The shack flickered back into reality. Mason stared at me, grinning with that abyss-black gaze. Lee floated unnaturally, her hair drifting like she was underwater. And all three of us heard it at the same time. A knock. At the door. From outside. One slow, deliberate tap. Like something that had been watching us all night. The air froze. The shadow inside the shack recoiled, not in fear but in anticipation. Mason whispered, "It's here." Lee whispered, "It's coming for you." My heartbeat slowed, then stopped, just for a moment, just long enough for the shadow to slip deeper into me. I didn't know what was outside. I only knew this. Whatever knocked wasn't human, and it wasn't asking permission to come in. The second knock was softer, almost polite, but it hit me harder than a punch to the chest. Everything inside the shack went completely still. Mason stopped chanting. Lee stopped drifting. Even the walls stopped pulsing. The shadow inside the room coiled tighter, like a predator tensing before a strike. I didn't want to look toward the door, but my body did it on its own. The old wooden frame trembled as a thin mist leaked through the cracks, pooling across the floor in a slow, spreading tide. It was colder than anything I'd ever felt. My breath condensed instantly, forming pale plumes that floated upward instead of down, as if gravity was beginning to lose interest in this place. A third knock. This one came from behind us, but the door hadn't moved. I spun around, and every wall in the shack now had a door, rotted, crooked, shifting in and out of existence like mirages. Some were dripping seawater. Some were covered in claw marks. One was slowly bending inward, as if something massive pressed against it from the other side. Lee smiled like she'd been waiting for this moment. "They're offering you a way in," she whispered, "or a way out, same thing, really." Mason stepped toward the original door, the one we actually entered through. His movements were jerky, like he was being guided by unseen strings. He put his ear to the wood. A voice whispered through it. Not a human voice, not even close. It was layered, hundreds speaking at once, yet somehow forming a single message. "We found you." Mason's black eyes widened with an emotion I had never seen on him: reverence. He reached for the knob. I grabbed his wrist. Something inside the shack growled. Not an animal. Not the shadow. Something bigger. The entire building leaned, as if the ground beneath it had shifted. Objects slid across the floor. Windows stretched into tall, arched shapes, distorting like reflections on black water. Mason snarled at me, a sound no human vocal cords should make. "Let go, you don't know what waits for you." "Neither do you," I shouted back, but my voice cracked with fear. He tore his arm free with impossible strength and swung the door open. But there was no outside. No forest. No night sky. No earth. Only a vast, bottomless black ocean, stretching infinitely in every direction, vertical and horizontal at the same time. Waves rolled upward. Stars shimmered beneath the surface. It was like looking into a universe that drowned. A shape moved beneath the impossible water, a colossal silhouette shifting lazily, aware, curious. Lee sank to her knees, whispering ecstatically, "It sees us." I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The ocean began pouring into the shack, not as water but as darkness, thick and oil-like, spiraling around Mason's legs and pulling him forward. He didn't resist. He stepped into it, arms open, welcoming, disappearing without a splash. Lee followed him, drifting like a leaf caught in a current. I staggered back, tripping over a chair that dissolved into smoke when I hit it. The darkness reached for me next, slow, deliberate, intelligent. But something stopped it. A hand grabbed my shoulder from behind. Human, warm. I jolted away, spinning. And froze. Standing there, covered in mud and blood and shaking violently, was Evan. But Evan wasn't supposed to be here. He shouldn't have been anywhere near this place. We'd left him on the mountain trail days ago. He looked at me with wild eyes and whispered, "Don't let it take you. Don't look at it. Don't listen." Then the walls exploded with a deafening roar as the darkness surged inward like a tidal wave. The shack shattered. The floor disappeared. And we were falling, both of us, into the ocean that wasn't an ocean. We fell for what felt like an eternity. Not down, not forward, just through the infinite black ocean that twisted reality around us. I could hear the muffled echoes of Mason and Lee laughing, their voices stretching and splitting, circling around me, teasing me. Evan's hand gripped mine like a lifeline, his fingers burning cold. His eyes were wide, reflecting the impossible depth below us. This isn't water, he gasped. It's a boundary between worlds. The pressure around us was physical, mental, spiritual. I felt memories I didn't have, places I'd never seen, and pain I couldn't remember. Shapes moved in the blackness, vast and slow, their size defying comprehension. They weren't swimming, they were waiting. A massive silhouette emerged from the darkness. It resembled a creature from a nightmare, with countless limbs and eyes that opened and closed on impossible angles. Its gaze wasn't on us, but through us, like it was reading everything I had ever done, every thought I had ever held. Evan pulled me closer. "Don't let it know we're afraid," he whispered, voice trembling. "Fear, it feeds on fear." We began to descend into a trench that opened beneath the swirling void, a canyon carved through the abyss itself. The walls shimmered with strange runes that glowed faintly in colors I couldn't name, reflecting memories of people I might have known, moments I might have lived. Then I felt it, a presence behind me, patient, watching. It didn't move like a predator, it moved like inevitability. Every instinct screamed that turning around would change everything. I didn't. I focused on Evan, on the cold, burning grip of his hand. Something touched my mind. Not words, not thoughts. Memories, entire lifetimes, folding over themselves like pages in a book I couldn't close, and a single phrase drilled into my skull. Choose the path or be consumed. The trench widened below us into a cavern of impossible scale, walls stretching out of sight, glowing runes swirling faster, pulling us down. And in the center, a figure waited, something humanoid but enormous, its head vanishing into the shadows above, arms stretching like the branches of a dead forest, and eyes glimmering like drowned stars. Evan whispered, "This is it, the heart of it, the one they warned us about." The ground, or whatever served as the floor, began to ripple like liquid, sending tremors up through me. The entity moved, slowly, deliberately, and the darkness around us thickened, solidifying into shapes, faces, claws, mouths. I realized with a sick clarity that it wasn't just a creature. It was a consciousness. The trench was its body, the void its mind, and it knew we had arrived. "Whatever happens next," Evan said, voice barely audible, "we either fight or we let it take everything." The trench exhaled, a living, shuddering breath of darkness, and we plunged further into the unknown. The deeper we fell, the more the darkness seemed to think, to watch, to mock us. It wasn't just an absence of light. It was alive, bending reality around us. The trench had no bottom, no end. Every glance revealed impossible geometry, walls that folded into themselves, corridors that led nowhere, and shadows that moved counter to our motions. Mason's voice crackled over the comms, distant and distorted. "Evan, Zulkifil, are you seeing this?" His words stretched into static, and when I blinked, his image flickered, replaced by a memory of him I didn't recognize, him smiling at me but with hollow, empty eyes. Lee grabbed my arm. Her hands were trembling, yet her eyes burned with defiance. "It's testing us. It wants us to break. It wants us to see ourselves as less than human, as prey." The figure in the center of the abyss shifted. Limbs stretched impossibly long, brushing against the trench walls, folding in ways no flesh should. Its eyes, drowned stars, focused on us, piercing, understanding. A low vibration filled the water around us, resonating in our bones, echoing memories we had buried long ago. Guilt, fear, shame, regret. I felt my mind fraying. Names, places, faces, decisions, everything blended into a single nauseating whirl. I stumbled and the trench responded. The walls twisted, forming faces from my memories, twisted parodies of friends, family, and strangers, mocking me, screaming in silent mouths. Evan's voice broke through my panic. "Focus. They can't hurt what you won't let them." We linked hands, forming a circle of solidarity in the infinite black. Each of us forced ourselves to remember, we are alive, we are here, we are human. The entity's eyes flared and the darkness thickened, solidifying into a massive, semi-transparent shape that resembled a cathedral of limbs and faces. And then, unexpectedly, it spoke, not in words but in sensations, in knowledge. Every thought I'd ever held was mirrored back at me, and I understood. It was a collector of existence, feeding not on bodies but on memory, on the essence of who we are. It had no malice, no intent to kill, only to absorb, to preserve, and to understand. Evan whispered almost reverently, this is why they kept it secret. Nothing human can truly leave here unchanged. The cavern's walls pulsed like a heartbeat. I realized we had a choice: to submit, to let the entity fold our essence into its infinite mind, or to resist and find a way out of the abyss entirely, risking obliteration. Lee clenched her fists, eyes glowing with stubborn resolve. We survive, that's what we do, together. The entity shifted closer, its immense eyes locking onto ours, waiting, curious. The trench trembled beneath us, as though the abyss itself held its breath, awaiting our next move. And in that suspended moment, I felt a terrifying clarity. Whatever decision we made now would change the fabric of who we are forever. The entity drifted closer, an ocean-sized silhouette made of memory, shadow, and something older than language. Its presence pressed against our minds, not violently, but with a terrible patience, like a teacher waiting for a child to understand a lesson far beyond their years. Evan tightened his grip on my wrist. Lee steadied herself beside me, her breath sharp and controlled. The abyss around us pulsed with quiet intelligence. Every distant heartbeat of the trench shook loose pieces of our past, faces we tried to forget, mistakes we tried to bury, fears we never faced. They drifted through the water like pale ghosts. I swallowed hard. It's showing us everything we are. No, Lee whispered, eyes wide and glassy. It's weighing us. A low vibration rippled through the void around us. The shape before us unfolded, massive limbs curling back into the dark, revealing a surface like polished black stone. The entity had no single form. It was a shifting collage of everything it had ever absorbed. And now it was studying us, layer by layer. Memories, my memories, spilled into the abyss. My grandfather's funeral. The night the storm took our boat. The guilt of surviving when I shouldn't have. All of it drifted outward, swirling into its waiting mind. I gasped, it's pulling from me. Evan's voice trembled, fight it. But how do you fight something inside your own head? Something that already knows every weakness, every fear, every fault. Lee's scream cut through the water. I turned and saw a second shape forming behind her. It was her, but hollow-eyed, gaunt, drowned. The copy opened its mouth, and from it spilled all the words Lee wished she had never said, all the regrets she tried to bury. Evan's double crawled from the wall next, its limbs too long, its grin knowing and cruel. It whispered things none of us should have known, secrets Evan had never spoken aloud. I looked down and froze. Another version of me was staring back. Pale, sunken, something missing behind the eyes. My copy reached out with a trembling hand, its voice scraping the trench walls. You don't deserve to leave. The entity wasn't showing us illusions. It was showing us what we could become if we surrendered. Unthinking echoes trapped in the trench forever. Lee thrashed against the water. Don't let it take you, keep breathing, keep fighting. The copies lunged. The entity surged. The abyss folded around us like a giant closing fist. And then, for the first time since we entered the trench, the entity's true voice formed words inside us, resonating like a cathedral collapsing. You are not yet mine. The doubles froze. The trench stilled. Every shadow leaned in. And the entity waited. For our choice. leave with the weight of its knowledge, or stay and become part of it forever. Evan looked at me, his expression hollow with terror and awe. Lee wiped blood from her nose, trembling but still refusing to break. "Whatever we choose now," she whispered, "it will follow us home,